Hi, it's my great privilege to introduce Jean Chen Ho, the 2023 Mary Routt Chair of Creative Writing and Journalism. Let me say a little bit about the Routt Chair. It was made possible by a donation from journalist Mary Patterson Routt, who was a member of the first Board of Trustees for Scripps College, serving in that capacity from 1926 to 1965, and playing an active role in the development of the college. Her donation allows the college to bring a nationally recognized professional writer to campus each spring, where the chair teaches a semester-long course in their specialty, delivers 2 public presentations, and often arranges for other acclaimed writers to visit campus for readings. So please come back next week for Jean's conversation with Karen Tae Yamashita next Thursday, April 13th at 6 p.m. in Balch Auditorium. Jean Chen Ho has a PhD in literature and creative writing from USC and an MFA from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. She also has a BA degree in English from UC Berkeley, as do Warren Liu and I, although they are way younger than me. You might know Jean as the author of Fiona and Jane, one of Time's 100 must-read books of 2022, named a Best Book of the Year by NPR, Vulture, Vogue, Oprah Daily, Glamour, Harper's Bazaar, and Elle, and longlisted for the 2022 Story Prize. I also saw this book in the Hudson Bookstore at LAX in the ranked list of bestsellers in February. So it's reaching a wide audience. The Boston Globe said that this novel deftly renders both young women in their messy passage to adulthood, and Oprah said it was sparkling and irresistible. Jean's writing, which includes fiction, creative nonfiction, essays, and journalism, appears in New York Times Magazine, The Cut, Electric Literature, Los Angeles Times, Georgia Review, Guernica, and many other places. She's also been awarded many, many awards. I was calculating 1 to 2 per year for the past decade. And she has been selected for many prestigious residencies. If you follow her on Twitter, you'll find some great quotes. If you follow her on Instagram, you can see her in all kinds of amazing outfits. And by all accounts that I have received, she is a brilliant, funny, and warm professor to our students this semester. Serving as Jean's interlocutor is Associate Professor of English, Warren Liu. He received his BA and PhD from UC Berkeley. He also received his MFA from the University of Iowa. He teaches and has published various kinds of professional work, both scholarly and creative, on American poetry and poetics, contemporary American literature, and Asian American literature. This includes working as the librettist for a musical story that was performed in Interstitial, a book of musical stories at USC last year, being interviewed for a podcast on poetry, and writing poems that quote-unquote sing. Warren has won the Johnson Faculty Achievement Awards in teaching, professional work, and service, and he once told me that he wanted to write a book of poems about using the bathroom while traveling internationally, and I think I spotted at least one of those online. Please welcome our guests.
Hi, thank you, Kim, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you, everyone, for being here. Warren, I'm so looking forward to our conversation after this reading. Thank you, Scripps. Thank you, Marcy. I have had such a wonderful time being a visiting professor here, especially now that the weather is warming up. It's so lovely to see the campus coming alive and students enjoying the lawn. So it's been a real pleasure to be in community with everyone here at Scripps. I feel just so grateful and honored. Not the least of which because my class was double posted and both sections filled, and then Professor Allison G here filled in for us and took on the second section. So there's certainly such an overwhelming interest in writing and thinking and fiction and the intersection of art and politics, which is what my class is about here. So it's very heartening for me as a fiction writer. Okay, so I'm going to read a little bit from the book Fiona and Jane. This book has been out in the world for about a year. It came out in January of 2022, and it's a linked story collection. I've been insisting that it's a linked story collection, though many reviewers and such have called it a novel, and friends of mine have said that it reads like a novel. But I think of the project as a linked story collection because I worked very hard on each of these individual stories to make them stand alone. But the book is told in alternating voices. Half the stories are from Fiona and half the stories are from Jane. They're two best friends who grew up together here in Southern California. They're both Taiwanese American. Fiona is sort of the leader in this friendship. She's ambitious and brilliant and always knows what to do. And Jane is sort of the friend who has a much more dreamy disposition, and she follows Fiona's lead. And the book spans about over 20 years of their friendship. So chronologically, the earliest story, which I'll read from today, is when the girls are 15. And then in their 20s, they split apart. Fiona moves to New York and lives her life. Jane stays in LA. And they suffer this estrangement in their friendship, but come back together in their 30s. And by the end of the book, they reconcile and really relearn what it means to be friends again as adults. So I'm going to read a section from a story called Go Slow, which I guess I'm not supposed to have favorite stories in here, but I have to say it is maybe not my most favorite, but one of my favorites. So this is a story that's told from Jane's point of view. The year we turned 16, Fiona decided it was time we learned to drink. We drove to the Norwalk swap meet and laid out $50 each for fake IDs from a passport photo faxing and color copy stall. A Gujarati family owned the business, and the girl we paid off had graduated from our high school a few years back. When she handed us the finished IDs, we knew right away we'd been scammed. They were flimsy, laminated jobs, no better than Blockbuster membership cards, overexposed photos of our unsmiling faces glued onto a rectangle of white paper with California identification card typed across the top, our names and birthdays below, minus those crucial 5 years to age us up to 21. We were too embarrassed to demand our money back. Still, we were eager to test them out. That was when we called Juan. He said he knew a place, and the three of us set out one Saturday night in Shamu, Fiona's hatchback she named after the SeaWorld killer whale because of the corroding white patches all over the black paint. The freeway glowed with stop-and-go brake lights. We barely moved, no more than 10, 12, 15 miles an hour. 7:30 at night, the sky was a washed-out indigo, a few dirty gray wisps hanging low. No doubt Shamu was a hoopty, but she was ours. Well, she was Fiona's, which meant she was mine, too. We were best friends. We shared everything. Juan leaned forward from the back seat. "Lucky this place isn't card," he said. "You guys are dumb if you think those janky IDs will get you anywhere." "Put your seatbelt on before I get a ticket," Fiona said. Juan gave her the name of the exit, somewhere off the 5 in Garden Grove. He was taking us to a Sue Jeep, he called it. "Trust me," Juan said, "it's going to work out. Just be cool. You hear that, Jane?" "Shut up," I said. "I can be cool." "Behind there, it's that place in the corner." I looked out the windshield to where Juan was pointing. Fiona steered into the parking lot of a strip mall. She hesitated. "Should I right in front?" Between a brightly lit 24-hour donut shop and a dry cleaner's with its pleated metal shutter pulled down for the night, there stood an unmarked storefront with a row of large windows, the glass tinted black. You couldn't see inside at all. A neon sign buzzed red in one of the darkened panes, something spelled out in Korean characters. I exchanged a quick glance with Fiona before we climbed out of Shamu. I could see the excitement in her eyes and that she was trying to hide it. We trailed in behind Juan and sat down at a booth. By the way, Juan is spelled W-O-N, not Juan, Juan. I feel like when I've read this story, people have been confused by that. We trailed in behind Juan and sat down at a booth. The place looked nothing like the bars I'd seen on TV. First of all, there was no bar to speak of, no bartender standing behind a long countertop lined with stools. There were tables and chairs and booths, just like at a restaurant, except the lights were dimmed. I smelled fry oil and garlic in the air, and some cleaning agent, a chemical scent like chlorine, but covered by citrus. The walls were papered in newsprint comic strips and glossy magazine ads that people had tagged over and black Sharpie markers in English and Korean. When the waiter approached, Juan did all the talking. His voice sounded different in Korean, harder somehow, like stone striking stone. The waiter, unsmiling, tipped his head toward Fiona and me. A name tag pinned to his black button-down shirt read Sung, S-U-N-G. A raised pink scar stretched from his left ear to his chin, where a thin patch of short black hair sprouted. I noticed Fiona watching him. Juan answered him, and the waiter nodded, then backed away. "What'd he say?" I asked. "It's cool," said Juan. "Should we show him our IDs?" Juan just shook his head and laughed. A minute later, the waiter materialized with a tall pitcher of beer and 3 frosted mugs on a tray. We fell into a nervous silence as he placed everything on the table. Soon as he walked off, Fiona and I looked at each other and busted up laughing. Juan poured out 3 glasses. My first taste of beer nearly made me gag. I sipped slowly, trying to get used to the bitter taste, the bubbles burning down my throat. Half a glass in, I felt heady, my face warm to the touch. "You like it?" Juan said. "This is nice, right?" A loud burp escaped Fiona's throat, and she clapped a hand over her mouth. "I don't know how I feel," I replied honestly. "Is this drunk? Am I?" Juan refilled my glass. "Juan, I love you," Fiona said. He grunted. "No, really," she said earnestly. "I love you." She turned to me. "And Jane, I love you too. I love you the most." This one turned into a happy ass. Juan looked as pleased as I'd ever seen him. "What about you?" "Jane," said Fiona from across the table. "Girl, you okay?" "I love you too," I said. "Oh shit," Juan said. "You're one of those depressed drunks." "What?" I said. "No, I'm not." "2 types," Juan said knowingly. "You're not going to start crying, are you?" "The waiter," Fiona said. "He's kind of cute." "Him?" Juan said. "You got on beer goggles." "I do," Fiona said. "What's that?" Then she laughed again. I'm going to read a section that goes into their friendship when they're younger. So, Fiona, Juan, and I have been friends since 2nd grade, Miss King's class. Same junior high and same high school too, until Juan got tossed last year when we were sophomores. He was already on probation for ditching, a couple of fights, some other stuff. Then one day last April, this football player, a big Samoan dude, decided to punk him for no good reason. Juan had the kind of face that summoned bullies like flies to dog shit. They thought he was stuck up because of the Boys to Men-inspired cable knit sweaters, preppy button-down shirts, and cuffed chinos he wore when everyone else sported white tube socks with Adidas slides, size 40 waist jeans, and double XL Fruit of the Loom tees. People called him Pretty Boy and Richie Rich, and they didn't mean it like a compliment either. Fetu towed up at lunchtime and said he heard Juan was talking trash about his girl. Not only did Juan suffer the humiliation of getting his ass beat in front of everyone in the quad, our evil vice principal decided it was the last straw for Juan's disciplinary offenses and kicked him out. Nothing happened to Fetu. He was a senior with 2 months left, and untouchable anyway because of his rushing yards average. Juan got sent down to the continuation school with the druggies, pregnant girls, and gangbangers. Last stop before dropping out, juvie, or deportation. Juan wasn't who he thought he was, though. Juan wasn't who people thought he was, though. He wasn't some spoiled fuck-up with a dad who owned a chain of liquor stores or gas stations or SAT cram schools. We knew other Koreans like that, sure. But Juan ganked all his fancy clothes. Shoplifting came easy to him, Juan said, because mall security was always too busy hassling the black kids to notice a skinny Asian redeeming his 5-finger discount. For years, he'd used a fake address to go to school with us, a better district than the one in his zip code. Most of the boys we knew from school were Neanderthals with pimples drenched in cool water cologne. Juan wasn't like them. He was different. We felt safe with him. Fiona and I would never actually tell him to his face, but Juan was all right by us. I'm going to skip ahead a little more. They're still drinking at the bar. This is their first time getting drunk, but this is a scene that happens when they decide they're gonna go for a drive after this this incident or this experience at the bar. Okay, let's bounce. When Juan stood from the table, Sung's gaze shifted to him and back to Fiona again. I made Juan promise to drive slow. On the way to Huntington Beach, we passed by an Albert Tacos, and Juan pulled into the drive-thru. Fiona, slumped in the passenger seat, perked up and leaned over Juan to shout into the crackling box. Carne asada taquitos, she cried. Con salsa roja, por favor. Gracias. To Juan and me, she said, slurring, I'm taking AP Spanish, okay? I'm getting a 5 on that bitch. We cackled and hooted, called her a nerd. Everyone at school knew Fiona was smart and respected her giant brain, but she wasn't considered a geek. She had those big doe eyes with real double eyelids that other girls tried to approximate with bits of glue or tiny strips of Scotch tape. Her lashes went out to there, and her skin hardly ever broke out. And because she had her tutoring gigs with more clients all the time from positive recommendations, Fiona always had dough to spend on new clothes and kicks. She worked extra hard the last 6 months to save up cash and buy Shamu. This is so weird, Fiona said. I've never sat here before. She turned her head to look at me. It's like I'm you. Ever since Fiona got Shamu, my butt has been a permanent fixture in Shotgun. A new level of freedom has suddenly opened up. No more running to catch the bus, no more begging our parents for rides. Sometimes we cruise down PCH to Seal Beach and try to sneak into one of the fancy hotel pools, parking blocks off so no one would suspect us of trespassing. At night, we drove up to Signal Hill, where the rich white families lived, to steal their views of the Long Beach Basin glittering all the way out to the Queen Mary, that old haunted ship. When it was especially clear, you could see lights from Catalina Island winking out of the ink-black water. And now here we were, drunk for the first time. I'd wanted to give up after the swap meet debacle, but she'd pressed on, insisted we call up Juan. Fiona always knew what to do. You ever gonna learn to drive? Juan said. I found his eyes in the rearview mirror and stuck out my tongue. So what if I'd failed the driving test a couple times? I just needed a little more practice. Tell the truth, I heard you hit a hydrant. The DMV's racist, I said. They didn't even make Tim Lockwood parallel park, and that other wrestler guy, what's his name? I heard he ran a stop sign, but they passed him anyway. Nah, said Juan, you just suck at driving. I kicked the back of his seat. I hate you so much, shut up. But I was laughing too. You love me, been in love since Miss King, he sang. Give it up, Jane, never gonna happen. You think Miss King ever misses us? Fiona said. You guys, I have the best idea. Her voice was breathless, full of ardor. We should go visit her. Quit hogging the taquitos, I said. We passed the Albert Taco sack between us all the way to the beach. Fiona had a mixtape playing, a cassette one of her admirers had made, Whitney Houston, Tony, Salt and Pepper. Slouched in the back of Shamu, I crunched on those thick, greasy sticks, the wind brushing my cheeks and the bass thrumming through my back. The air started smelling of salt. I took it in big gulps. Juan pulled into a parking lot empty of cars at this time of night, and Fiona turned the music off. We sat there, cradled inside Shamu, listening to the waves beat against the sand and roll back out. We couldn't see anything out there at all. For a while, no one said a word. I recalled a Bible story from years back when I used to go to church with my parents before Baba moved back to Taiwan. Jonah trapped inside the whale, waiting for God to rescue him. The moral was something about betrayal and repentance, forgiveness and second chances. Here with Fiona and Juan, I didn't want to be saved. I made a silent wish to stay like this forever, the three of us, perfect. A shiver went through me. The weight in my shoulders disappeared. Juan was wrong about me in what he said earlier, the two drunk personalities. I was happy. Thank you. Okay, so I guess, Warren, would you like to come up here and talk to me?
Hello? Can you hear me?
Hi.
Yes. Awesome. Thank you so much for that wonderful reading. That is also one of my favorite stories in the book. So I'm glad that you read for that.
You have good taste.
I thought maybe we could just start with a kind of a couple questions about, I guess, stylistic choices or just the way that you kind of constructed the book. The first one would just be, I'm curious about the insistence on, and I've heard you say this in other interviews that I've read online, that it's not a novel, that it's a collection of stories. And I guess my question is, like, in your mind, what makes it not a novel? Because when I read it, I mean, it felt novelistic.
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious about that distinction and maybe why you want to think of it as a collection of stories rather than a novel.
I think that the narrative engine for a short story is very different than what works for me as a novel. And so usually when I think about, I mean, this is going to be a very academic, nerdy answer. When I think about...
Those are the best.
Yeah. I think, and I have to say, I'm writing a novel right now. So my second book, I'm actively trying to write a novel. So I've been thinking a lot about what sustains a long work like that, you know, and for me, there's some like big question that I want to ask that I'm curious about. And when I was writing Fiona and Jane, I feel like each of the stories addressed some concern, some question I had, and because of the economy of the short story, you have to get to start answering that question much faster and try to resolve or raise more questions or, you know, really attack that concern in a way in a short story that I think the novel as a form doesn't really force you to. But I don't know. I'm writing the novel and we'll see if I succeed.
That's really interesting. Maybe I could ask just to kind of follow up, because one of the things I noticed, and for those of you who haven't read the book, it not only does it jump back and forth between sort of the story of Fiona and the story of Jane, but also it kind of moves you through space and time in really interesting ways where you'll go forward and then you'll go back and something will have happened that you already know about, but one of the characters doesn't yet know about because it's happened in the past, or sorry, in the future. But one other thing that happens is that these other narratives float in and out. Right, so there's a story of Kenji, a college friend who has cancer and then survives. There's a story of course, Jane's father and his suicide. And what's interesting about reading the book is that those are all like potential like other narratives that feel like they could have been built in, but they're not. Like you want to know more, but the book kind of always brings you back to focus on Fiona and Jane. I'm just wondering if that was hard to do, like or was that part of the function of the short story? Because there's so many other narratives in the story where you're like, oh man, I really want to know more about this guy or this gal, right? So I'm just curious about, like, as you were making those choices, if it was tough to let go of some of those other stories. And did you do that in the service of the kind of focus on what you're saying, the immediacy of the short story?
Yeah, I mean, when I was writing these stories, I mean, and even before I began this project, I'd always been writing stories about friendship and the lives of women and girls, you know, whether it's about their families or romance or all of my protagonists tended to be women and girls. And then, you know, that Kenji story that you mentioned, that was sort of like a writing challenge I gave myself to write a story from the point of view of a man. And I failed. Like that story in its final iteration that's published, that's probably like the 50th version of that story because, you know, I had to write so many drafts to get to know that character, even though ironically he's like silent through most of that story because he's going through cancer treatment. And I wanted to get to know the man that Fiona was in this toxic relationship with. So I wrote a lot of drafts to get to know those characters. And then I had to like throw all of that away because I realized what I was most interested in that story and in this project is how all of that is filtered through the consciousness of the character of Fiona. And then even more so how in that story, she's sort of thinking about, well, you know, Jane, who is my childhood best friend and is not in my life in this present moment, how would she deal with this? So there's a couple of stories like that one when Fiona is in New York and she moved there with a lot of ambition and she knew she was going to go to law school. She was going to like get married to this guy. And like, you know, she had her whole life set and then she goes through a bunch of failures, romantic, career-wise. And she really has to like reckon with her identity because she'd always thought of herself as this winning person. And she'd always thought of Jane as somebody who was her follower, like somebody who was sort of like drifting about and not necessarily making smart choices, right? And then when Fiona herself becomes that sort of person, she's disappointed in herself, but she begins to see her best friend in a much more compassionate way. So in that story, and in a couple of stories when she's like living her life in New York and kind of being a failure, she begins to wonder like, oh, well, how would Jane deal with this? And meanwhile, the book also has stories from Jane's point of view where you get like a totally different sense of how she's actually thinking about their friendship and how that friendship has shaped her life. So I was really interested in just the relationship between these two women, even though many of the stories, one character is like totally not present, like she's off the page, right? So as the project was coming together, that was what was like the organizing principle of it being this linked collection.
I'm wondering, okay. Maybe just I'll ask a couple more questions and then we can turn it over to the audience. One thing I'm really curious about is this idea of failure. And I'm wondering if because part of what's interesting about the book is not just that it focuses on these characters as they grow into themselves in terms of both kind of like, I think kind of a racial identity, but also in terms of sexual and gender like positions, but also class is a really important part of the novel. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how class informed the way you think about the characters in relation to those failures, because of course, Fiona and Jane come from different class backgrounds, and that's something that's noted right away in the beginning of the book, and it seems to kind of like follow them as they age. And I'm just curious about this idea of failure, especially from sort of thinking about Fiona as the one who's like the scrappy one, right? The one who's like, oh, Jane, you're fine, right? And then I'm curious, there's a couple of moments in the novel where that class, assumptions about class position lead to like a kind of conflict, right? So that when she's dating Gabriel, is that right? Okay. And he thinks that she's wealthy because she's like subletting this apartment, right? Yeah. So I'm just curious how class kind of embedded itself in those narratives, and like maybe if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I have so much to say about that. Oh, I could talk for a really long time. And you know, as I was writing these stories, I thought so much about how, you know, the larger social forces exert themselves on these women in terms of class identity, ethnic, racial identity, also like a Southern California Asian American identity, which is very close to my own. You know, I was born in Taiwan, and my family moved here in the 80s, and I grew up in Cerritos. So Cerritos is not named in this book in particular, but it's a suburb in LA County, and that's sort of where I imagine Fiona and Jane are living their lives. So you know, so I grew up around a lot of like Koreans, like Juan. I grew up around a lot of Asian American people, even though I didn't think of that necessarily so consciously when I was, you know, in junior high and high school. And so, you know, even the part that I read from Go Slow, that story, so much of that, of like sort of what's underneath. So, I mean, the story is about them like being teenagers and getting drunk and like learning how to drive and going out and sort of like testing the boundaries of what it means to be a young person, which I'm very interested in. But it's also about everything that you're asking about, which is like, who am I in terms of my ethnic identity, and like what is, you know, there's like a line in there that I put about how people, Juan is like shoplifting from the mall, and he like later on it's like revealed that he has like this side hustle, right? And then you know, there's like a line in there about how he's been using a fake address to go to school with us, right? Which is like a very, I think, typical sort of like subversive way of like class ascension, right? But and like I knew a ton of people who would like do stuff like that, and even like right now in my life, like I have friends who are parents who are like, oh, we have to move into the right neighborhood, or like, how am I going to send my kids to a certain school because we're not in the right zip code? And it's like, I grew up around all of those questions of race and class, but it wasn't so obvious to me then. And it's only in writing these stories that I considered how expansive and complicated an Asian American identity can be and must be in fiction, right? Like, it's not just, I didn't want to write a book that was just about like one particular kind of Taiwanese American identity, right? And I didn't want to like necessarily focus on like a first generation immigrant family and the second generation child like being having some sort of trauma or like conflict with her parents or something like that. I feel like that wasn't the story I wanted to tell. I was much more interested in how, as friends, you have sort of like an Asian American or multicultural, multi-ethnic relationship as a young person, but these sorts of questions of class come into it without you even being aware of that. And how does that affect the ways that you perceive yourself and you perceive your friendship, and how do you reconcile that, right? So even though both Fiona and Jane grew up in the same community, they're both Taiwanese American, as you mentioned, they're from very different class backgrounds. And how does that affect their friendship in really meaningful and painful ways?
Yeah, thank you for that. That's really one thing I was thinking about, and it's kind of connected to this idea of failure as well. It's the way that the novel is sort of also, in some very subtle ways, trying to argue against that kind of model minority myth, particularly the assumption that like all Asian Americans just have some kind of automatic access to class mobility, right? That there's a way in which the kind of Asian American trajectory is always like, we started in Taiwan and we ended in Harvard, and now I'm like the president of some school, right? So there's a way in which that kind of building in the diversity of class experience is something that hasn't happened a lot in contemporary Asian American work, and I think it's such an interesting part of that book. So thanks for talking about that. I'm going to maybe just turn it over to the audience now, because I don't want to monopolize, although I have lots of other questions, but I do think it would be nice to hear from audience members as well. So if there are folks have questions for Jean, please feel free to chime in now, and you can raise your hand and I'll maybe come over with the mic. Oh, you have one. Oh, that's awesome.
Please ask questions. Anything. Yes, there's a hand in the front. Right here.
What inspires you to continuously write about people's cultural background and ethnicity? Of course, you told us that you grew up in Cerritos, but just wanted to. That is where we grew up too. Cerritos, our children and everybody. You know Whitney High School.
That's where I went to high school.
Yeah, that's where our children also went to. Just so we want to know what inspires you. You know.
What inspires me to keep writing about, in general, or about, well, everything, so many things. I don't know. I mean, in 2023, I feel like this is a really special year because I I finally feel alive again after the pandemic. I really feel like I went into a deep hibernation. And like, I don't know about you guys, but I was like extremely depressed and anxious in 2020. I lost my ability to like read novels. I mean, I could read short things. So I read a lot of poetry in that year, but my attention span just was really shot. And so I don't know. I think, this is going to be a very boring answer, but I feel like actually what inspires me is reading. You know, whenever I have a writing problem that I can't solve because I'm like, I don't know how to move this plot forward, or I don't know how to deepen this character that I'm trying to write, I go back to a book that I love. And the solution's always in a book that's already been written and published, and then you sort of steal from that. So yeah, that's what inspires me. And then the sort of the opposite answer to that, I think, is I'm just inspired by like being alive, you know, talking to other human beings, which, you know, we didn't get to do in the quarantine era. And so I often tell my students, I mean, if you're here, you'll know that I actually say this a lot. It's like, I love to eavesdrop. And just the way that people talk to one another, which shows their intimacy and their history, is so interesting to me. And the way that friends have a language and a shorthand with one another, and the ways, like, you know, like some of my best friends tell me they love me by insulting me, you know? And so it's like things like that through language that I really love. So, because so much of what we do and what we feel has to be expressed through language. And that inspires me, just, yeah, listening to people talking to one another. Okay.
Hi, thanks so much for your reading today. My name is Mirabella. I'm a junior here. I was really intrigued by what you said about trying and failing to write from a man's perspective on the Kenji story. And I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about the experience of like trying to inhabit a perspective or a narrator that has a completely different identity from you, whether it be racial, ethnic, class, gender. Do you think that's a challenge that more writers should try to pursue? Or like, how do you kind of feel about like the politics of that? And like, I'd just be curious to hear more about your experience trying that.
Yeah, I mean, I think people should be people are allowed to write whatever the hell they want. That's like always my general statement. Now, can you do it well? Like, that's the real test, you know? Can you actually make a human being with this character that you're writing? Can you make this character feel like somebody who actually has a beating heart? So I think, you know, every character that I write, whether she's a woman, whether she's Taiwanese American, or whether she's not, like whatever identity and life this character lives, it's not me. I have to make it up every time, you know? So I have some characters that have started out as either a version of someone I know, or like a composite of people that I know, or maybe it's a projection of my own ego or something, you know? And then through subsequent drafts, as I get to know that character, if I'm doing it right, that character is always going to tell me who they are in a way that's surprising. Just the way that people always tell you who they are in surprising ways. Like if you're paying attention, and not just receiving a person as you perceive them to be, which is what we all do, right? Like we're always like listening and seeing people not as who they are, but as how we are. But if you actually like are able to have a moment where you stop doing that. Like, people are always saying things and doing things that surprise you. And I think that's where the magic of fiction really takes off too. Like, if you've done a good job of getting to know that character and letting that character speak to you and reveal themselves to you, you just sort of have to like keep paying attention.
Yeah, thank you so much for talking today. I just had a quick question about what was it like with the processes of the two characters, Fiona and Jane? Like, I know you mentioned how you just had like different stories of these characters, but what made you like choose the stories that you put into this book that display these two characters, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so there's 10 stories in the book, and I wrote a few more. So, I mean, there were probably like maybe like 15 stories that I wanted to put in the book, and then we had to like delete those other ones that didn't fit. But the first story that I wrote in the book is a story called The Movers, and chronologically that happens when the two women are in their 30s, and Fiona has just moved back from New York after all of her like personal and professional failures. And then she quickly like gets into this relationship with the guy, then divorces him, and then the story begins when she's moving out of her apartment, and then Jane is helping her move out of this apartment. And the story is about them encountering these movers, and also about sort of them like having an unsteady footing in their friendship because they've been apart for 10 years, right? So that was the first story. And when I wrote that story, I was just interested in getting to know who these two characters were, right? And so I didn't know at that point that they had been friends since the second grade. I didn't know anything about who Jane really was. Like, in that story, the first draft of that story, there was some sense of like estrangement that the Jane character had from her dad. But at that point, I hadn't known that he was like a closeted man. I mean, if you read the book, you'll learn this. It's in the first story. So I didn't know that he was like suffering from mental illness. I didn't know that Jane herself was bisexual or pansexual. You know, I just knew that there were these two characters in their 30s who were like trying to figure out how to be friends again after this long separation. And so after I finished writing that story, it was published. You know, I was like working on other things, but I realized I was still interested in these two characters. Like, I wanted to know what caused their years of friendship estrangement, like what brought them together. And I wanted to know about their childhood, like who were they? I was just very curious. And so that was how this project began, just from that one story, because I wanted to just find out more about them.
Thank you so much for this great reading. I'm curious, since you mentioned you're working now on a novel, first of all, if there's anything you're ready to share publicly about that, but also especially how the writing process for that has been different from, or maybe similar to, the Linked Short Story Project.
It's been really different. So, because the novel, I feel like when I was writing the stories in Fiona and Jane, I was like intent on writing short stories. So each little thing that I was working on, I was like, okay, I only have like 30 pages to get through whatever is happening here. And then as I was growing the collection, I was like seeing connections in their friendship, and I was like picking out moments in their lives that I wanted to get to focus on. But with the novel that I'm working on, one, it's speculative and historical. So both of those modes are very different for me. I've gotten much more interested in speculative writing after writing Fiona and Jane, because I realized that, so, you know, I'll just say that the novel that I'm working on is set in the 19th century here in LA, and it's about it starts off with the 1871 Chinatown Massacre, which is like this flashpoint of racial violence that happened, where like 20 to 25 Chinese residents were lynched by by mob violence, right? And this sort of thing, and sort of like iterations of expulsions or racialized violence was pretty normal in that time against Asian immigrants, right? And so this was like an incident I had probably learned about in undergrad in an Asian American Studies class. And so I've been doing archival research around how that incident happened, and there were like trials after which, and all of it, as I was doing all of this research, I realized, I don't want to write this in a realistic literary mode, because part of my project isn't like, I don't want my project to like reanimate these people just to like violently kill them off again, right? Like I don't want to reproduce that same sort of violence in my book as what actually happened in history. I wanted to write something that has some sort of like reparative feeling, and I haven't quite figured out how to do that yet. But there's a sense I have that I have to write this in a more speculative mode. So that's what I'm working on, and it feels a lot different because of that genre switch. It also feels really different because I've done so much research of like some primary sources, but also lots of like secondary sources, reading about what it was like in that era, like what furniture was like and what kind of houses they lived in, like what kind of foods people ate, like what LA was like in the 1800s. And it's fascinating. Whereas for Fiona and Jane, like I didn't, the only research I did was sort of like emotional excavation about friendship. So yeah, so I'm excited to actually work with like archival materials for this new project. Is it time?
I think we're pretty much just out of time. Thank you so much, Jean, for that wonderful reading and Q&A. Yes.
Thank you.
I think there are books for sale in the back of the room. You should pick up a copy if you haven't read it. It's amazing. And thank you all for coming. Thanks, Jean.